Good morning, afternoon, and night, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar with Fuchsia Dunlop and Qian Jianan on Eat, Right, Love, How Food and Family Bridge China's Generations. My name is Yaling. I'm a reporter at Sixtone, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which I'll be hosting. Just over a month ago, Sixtone kicked off its first China rounding contest. And when you go on our website, sixtone.com, and after you read all the amazing news, features, and commentaries, you will scroll down to this banner, Generations, and be able to see all about this competition. So we believe that each generation has a story to tell, and Sixtone is inviting authors from across the globe to submit China-related nonfiction stories by April 30th, 2022. You'll be able to see the 8 amazing judges, how you can submit, and the latest announcements. And for those who are not familiar with Sixtone, we are an English language publication based in Shanghai, and we publish news, features, and commentaries from a human-centered perspective. There are 5 tones in Mandarin Chinese, and when it comes to coverage of China, Sixtone believes that there's room for other voices that go beyond buzzwords and headlines to tell the common stories of common people. As part of our contest, we are conducting interviews with our judges and hosting webinars to provide more inspirations for you, the writers who are looking to submit stories. The purpose of these webinars is to get writers thinking outside the books, to approach the theme, and to give you the opportunity to ask questions you may have regarding the rules. Our guests today are Fuchsia Dunlop and Qian Jianan. Fuchsia is a cook and writer specializing in Chinese cuisine. She attended culinary school in Chengdu in the 1990s and has written 6 books about Chinese food. Jianan writes in both Chinese and English. She now lives in Los Angeles, and she told us that she misses Shanghai terribly. Here's a little rundown of webinar today. Fuchsia and Jianan will each give a 15-minute talk, followed by a 20-minute conversation between them, moderated by me. Then the 2 guests will respond to the audience questions. Finally, I will answer audience questions about the writing contest itself. The whole Q&A will last about 30 minutes. A bit of house rules for audience. Please be clear and concise when you raise questions, and do not send spam messages. If you need tech help or you have any other feedback, you can raise your hand or leave your message in the chat box. Our team will come virtually to help you. When it comes to the final Q&A session, the questions are collected by our teams during the pre-event registration and in real time throughout the event. So please feel free to leave questions by clicking the Q&A button below anytime during the event. Interesting and frequently asked questions will be answered publicly during the Q&A session, and we'll also respond privately to other questions. Our webinar today is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube channel. If you want to review or share with your friend, feel free to follow us on our social media. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our 2 speakers, Fuchsia Dunlop and Qian Jianan. Again, if you have any questions for these amazing speakers, please leave the questions by clicking the Q&A button anytime. Fuchsia, do you mind sharing your thoughts first?
Hello, and thank you for joining us, everyone. It's a great pleasure to take part in this event. And of course, I'm missing Shanghai and China terribly in this long pandemic period. So I've been asked to talk a bit about generations and change in China. And of course, I first went to China in 1992, and I went to live in Chengdu in 1994. And I sometimes feel as if it's not just one generation, but many generations in terms of the scale of the social change, and particularly with food, as I'm going to talk about today. I was very close to my great grandmother, who was born in 1897. And when she talked about her life, the changes that had taken place were just enormous between hers and mine. And in China, sort of meeting older generation people when I was first in China, and just the lifestyle then and now, just many generations of change squeezed into about 30 years of time. And one thing I found quite surprising and touching with the response to my book, Yu Chu Hua Zhao, Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, is that, I was writing about a Chengdu that I knew very well in the 1990s. And for younger Chinese people, even people in Chengdu, people seem to think that I'm writing almost about a lost world, the old lanes and the old street trades of Chengdu. But anyway, with food, dramatic changes in that nearly 30-year period. And of course, the most prominent one is going from scarcity to plenty. So in the 1990s, there were still quite recent memories of rationing and hunger, and people who'd spent their youth craving for eating more meat. And the older generation had a very frugal attitude to eating. Not eating that much meat and cooking lots of vegetables. And in the last couple of decades, we've now gone to a state of plenty and even excess. And so, of course, the negative aspects of that are terrible waste, the kind of diseases of excess that we've had in Western countries for much longer, type 2 diabetes and other diet-related problems. And just a kind of extravagance that many people in China are now uneasy about. And in fact, you've had official campaigns against waste. And I remember particularly in a restaurant in Beijing, finding a small a piece of card on the table which had a picture of a rice bowl, a photograph of a rice bowl superimposed on it, a picture of a farmer working in the fields, a reference to that Tang Dynasty poem, Every Grain of Rice by Li Shen, which was actually the title of one of my books, but actually, a campaign against waste. But on the other hand, plenty has brought with it so much joy and fun and a real revival of this fantastic and exciting food culture. And I think I have been privileged to have spent a lot of time in China during this rediscovery of so much of the complexity, sophistication of Chinese cuisines. The other big change that's really striking is the change in the status of cooking. So when I was first in China in the 1990s, people didn't have as much disposable income. Cooking was a necessity of daily life. Most people were cooking from home. And of course, it was much easier because there were small markets with fresh produce in every neighborhood. There were no supermarkets. And also, a lot of the food was produced very close to the city. So in Chengdu, for example, when I first lived there, there was actually still one field within the ring road, the second ring road of Chengdu, which people were still farming. And just outside the second ring road, there was farmland. So farmers would bring in their bicycle carts with ducks and chickens and fresh produce to markets. And since then, of course, now a lot of people in cities at least have more cash to spend on dining out and less time. The markets, a lot of them have disappeared with the redevelopment of cities. There are now supermarkets. And I know that sort of elder Chinese people often still prefer to shop in the fresh markets, but younger people seem to be drawn more to supermarkets, as they are, here in England. Restaurants, there were restaurants in the 1990s, but they were less varied. So for example, in my neighborhood of Chengdu around the university, all the restaurants, I think, were serving sort of what was then traditional Sichuanese food, and it was all freshly made. Of course, now in Chengdu and in any Chinese city, you've got sort of chain restaurants, huge diversity of offerings. So in Chengdu now you can go out for Thai food or Japanese food or all kinds of different Western food, French patisserie, everything is on offer. There's so much choice. And of course you also have Meituan, all kinds of fast food delivery, which has meant that cooking has become an option, or for many people is something, a leisure pursuit or something optional, rather than the absolute necessity that it was in the 1990s. And there's a real change too in the kitchen. So I remember visiting friends, like my teacher at the university. Her kitchen was typical. It was in an apartment, but there was no decoration. It was a purely functional space just for preparing the daily food. And now some of my friends have new apartments with fitted kitchens, which look very attractive. So the kitchen has become a space where you might have friends to have dinner. And also, of course, people in the past in China didn't have ovens, and now some of them do have ovens. And that's a whole change as well, that with people cooking more internationally and doing Western baking. And it's quite funny because I correspond quite frequently with my friend and translator, He Yujia, on WeChat. And we had this sort of joke between us that we would send pictures of what we were cooking. And I would be sending her photographs of very old-fashioned traditional Sichuanese food that I've been cooking in my kitchen in London. And she would be sending me pictures of Western cakes and biscuits that she was making in her oven in her new kitchen in Chengdu. So the whole role and status and character of cooking at home has completely changed. And of course, the other sort of incredible seismic change, which I know will be the focus of this webinar, is just the change in families. And one, I remember in Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, I wrote about my visits to my friend's family in rural Gansu in 1995. At that time, most families lived very closely together, often 3 generations living together. People lived in the same villages that they'd lived for generations. And what's happened now is the sort of dispersal of the family. So in that particular village, my friend and his 2 siblings have all moved away to the city, as have the young people, you know, of their neighbors' families and in villages all over China. And so now you have, you know, migrant parents living in cities, sometimes with the children, but often with the children left behind in the villages. And of course, this completely changes the contexts of food and traditional food culture, because you have the grandparents cooking for the children, but not teaching, not passing on their skills and knowledge to the middle generation, you know, my friends and that kind of middle generation. And in the cities too, you know, you have this setup often where grandparents are cooking for the small children and the middle generation are not learning to cook. And that's the same with a lot of my friends, that they have not really learned the cooking skills and the food traditions from their parents. And I find one thing that makes me really sad about this too is that young Chinese people, children, are under such incredible pressure to study all the time. That they are not really having time for leisure, for fun, for play, and also for learning about food and cooking. When I was young, growing up in Oxford, my parents were very relaxed about schoolwork, and I was quite relaxed about schoolwork too. And I spent a lot of my free time cooking because I loved it and I found it creative and fun and rewarding. And of course, that's become something that's not only personally important to me, but it's also become my career. And so it does make me sad when I see the loss of skills to the younger Chinese generation. And I think this is partly influenced by a very, to me, very strange snobbery about cooking in China, because China is a nation that loves food and loves eating so much. And yet cooking, the actual cooking, has always been seen as fairly low status. And so one question that I've been asked so often in interviews since my books were published in Chinese is that, you know, Fuchsia, how did your parents cope with it when you decided as a Cambridge graduate that you were not going to pursue an academic career, but you wanted to write about food? And one journalist actually asked me how I personally had coped with the loss in status of going from being a Cambridge graduate student to being, you know, a cook and someone writing about food. And I found this question strange because I never experienced any loss in status, because I highly respect cooking as a profession and as a skill, and my parents too. There was no question that that choosing a path to do with food was anything less than, you know, going into a conventional academic career. So anyway, so that's something that makes me very sad, generational change, because I think that in China you have this absolutely extraordinary food culture, and much of it is professional and based on restaurants and so on. But I think the bedrock of a healthy, vibrant, diverse culinary culture is always home cooking. And I think that once you lose home cooking, you lose some of that, you know, the bedrock of the culinary culture, and something that creates the background to restaurant and chef cooking. And the other change, of course, which is related to what I've already talked about, is just in diets. And the most dramatic change, I suppose, is that I was very struck when I was first in Chengdu by how fresh and healthy the food was, and particularly how people ate so much less meat than they do typically in the West, in Britain and America. And they, you know, the habit was often to take a piece of meat that would have fed one American and cut it into small pieces and stir fry it with vegetables and make the meat go further. So you had meat which was used as a flavoring, but not as the main deal. And people ate a lot of healthy grains and vegetables. And now what's happened, of course, is that with the rising wealth in China, people are eating more and more meat and fish and seafood, which of course is delicious, but it's also very environmentally destructive, as we know in the West. You know, the American, British way of life of eating so much meat is very unsustainable. And so it seems ironic in a way that at a time when people in the West are asking the question, how can we eat less meat? How can we eat healthily and deliciously without putting such pressure on the environment? But in China, you have all the answers in a way. You have a food tradition which is so healthy and so sustainable, and yet the younger generation are perhaps forgetting this and losing touch with it. And similarly, one of the things that struck me most deeply about Chinese food culture is this intimate relationship between food and medicine. And that, you know, in China, food is medicine, and people just know how to alter their diets when they're feeling unwell, and to sort of prevent disease, not just treat disease, but to treat the first symptoms so that you prevent serious disease. This has had a deep impression on me and very much changed the way I eat at home in London even. But again, it seems that younger people in China, maybe this sort of healthy eating seems more old-fashioned, and I have the sense that people are losing touch with it. And I wish instead that younger people would learn from their parents and actually teach us in the West more about this very healthy and sustainable way of cooking. I'll just make one final point, which is that you know, about Sichuanese food specifically, that you know, again, going back to the health food angle, that I was so impressed by the healthy deliciousness of Sichuanese food. And that I know the stereotype is that it's all terribly hot and spicy, but actually Chengdu food in the 1990s, traditional Sichuanese food, especially home cooking, is all about balance. So if you have mapo tofu, you will also have a light soup, some gentle stir-fried vegetables. So a very healthy way of eating. And what's happened now with Sichuanese food becoming so popular is that there's been an emphasis on this mala drama, on piles of chilies and Sichuan pepper, loads of oil, loads of MSG. And I feel that obviously, perhaps this is about social media and about people wanting stimulation and excitement, but it's also somehow missing one of the golden things about traditional Sichuanese food, which was that it's about balance, it's healthy, it makes you feel good as well as taste good. Thank you.
Amazing. I'm just amazed by how many topics you were able to touch within those 15 minutes. I just want to mention, like, really sadly, as an like urban professional living in Shanghai, like my food habits right now is mostly order takeaways. And when I buy groceries, it's sometimes also through apps like Hema. And I do find it sad. I'm painfully aware of it, but it's something that the convenience has brought me, and something I can probably not change, like, for the better. But yes. So Jianan, it's your time to take the floor.
All right, just unmuted myself. Well, thank you, Fuchsia, for this fascinating talk. I always find I learned so many things from your book and your talk, and I'm a huge fan of shark's fin and Sichuan pepper. And then also, I have to confess, growing up, my mom kept me strictly like out of kitchen, partly because, as you mentioned, she wants me to focus on study. There is also an element like an extreme, like a feminist element in her decision. My mom feared that if I learned how to cook, I may want to fulfill the social expectation as a housewife. I mean, being a woman, my mom had this fear. And then interestingly, I learned to cook the first time while I studied in London as a graduate student, because I sort of had to. It's very expensive to eat outside. And now, after this is my 6th year in the United States, I enjoy cooking and even baking. And I always chat with my mom to exchange recipes. So cooking actually has become a new way for us to bond. And as for me, I have been asked to talk about generations and also how I become a writer. And then this might seems a little bit like a segue away from food, because food is not what got me into writing. And primarily, I consider myself mostly as a fiction writer, just because I can't resist the temptation to make things up. And usually, if people ask me how I become a fiction writer, I would tell them that I wrote my very first stories after my beloved grandpa, Ye Ye, passed away. Back then, the Chinese funeral baffled me. I was a college student, but still. And then on the funeral, I remember I was asked to cry out loud. I wasn't able to at that moment because all my feelings were still frozen from the tragedy. And then in contrast, someone I had never seen before dashed to the open casket and whined so loud as if he were a close family member. And then I didn't understand, the performative quality in this Chinese ritual. So I wrote my first stories to try to figure things out. And those stories, actually, fortunately enough, brought me a fiction prize at my alma mater. And then I knew I could write from that moment. But then if I were to tell you about my nonfiction writing, I think it started way earlier, and it was even more fun. My first nonfiction piece, according to myself, is entitled Snoring. Yeah, you didn't get it wrong, snoring. So I wrote it when I was 10. It was unpublished, of course, it was just for fun. That summer, I went to stay with my maternal grandma, 外婆. And then one day I just woke up to this idea that I wanted to describe the snoring sound everyone in my extended family made. And then the essay read something like the following. My uncle snored like a truck that was constantly running out of gas. As you thought the vehicle might be broken and leaned closer to check the engine, she started again. My aunt's snoring was much milder, as if humming a melody. It was a beautiful melody, but very brief. She repeated the same tune over and over again, which made me desperately wanted to switch the channel. So it was my 10-year-old self. And then also, I wasn't sure whether that day I was in my right mind because I showed the piece to my aunt right after I was finished with it. And then my aunt read it aloud to everyone during our lunch time that day. And then, I mean, everyone was around the dinner table. So my aunt, my uncle, my aunt, my father, mother, cousins were all cracking up, as you can imagine, with laughter. Nobody got mad at me. And to this day, I'm still grateful to it. And when my aunt finished the reading, she offered me only one suggestion. You must end your piece in a different way, she said, pointing to the final sentence I had on my page, which was, I invite you all to come home with me and listen to our snoring symphony at night. That's not the kind of invitation we'd like to extend, my aunt said. So you may have heard the saying, when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. But perhaps not so, at least in my family. Ever since that time, my family members love to share me with their stories. First, they were tales about the people in my extended family. For example, my maternal grandpa, 外公, he had died before I was born, so I never got a chance to meet him. However, he continued to live in the legends that were circulated inside my family. So if our participants remember the scene in Wong Kar-wai's movie, Days of Being Wild, that is 阿飞正传, there was a scene in which Tony Leung combed his hair with a generous amount of gel in front of a mirror. He looked extremely handsome in that scene. My grandpa was just like that. Even in his final days of life, I was told whenever he went out, he had to make sure that his hair looked perfect. And then in the earlier days when he was not that ill, he liked to roam the streets in the center Shanghai in his 3-piece tailored suit and a British walking stick. So there was no taboo in storytelling in my family. By that I mean dating stories are in demand. One of my distant aunts was the firstborn of her family. By custom, she was assigned a job to do the daily grocery shopping. And then she met her future husband right there in the local farmer's market, and he was a butcher. And I remember, and you have to excuse me, I was pretty young that time, and that question doesn't sound nice, but I was wondering how attractive could a butcher be when he was chopping meat and the bones. So when I was a teenager, I didn't pursue writing as a career. I didn't even think of being a writer back then, but the power of stories already captivated me. Stories make us laugh and cry, and then in laughter and tears we bond as a family or friends. And then stories also help me just appreciate others so much better and deeper. For me, my mom had been washing my hair for me until I was well into my 20s. My mom wasn't a person who would like to spoil me, but she did that. And then also I didn't know it was unusual. My mom washing my hair, because in my old 1-bedroom apartment in Shanghai, we didn't have a shower. So to wash my hair back then means that I have to crane my head into a basin in the kitchen sink. And then our water heater was quite old and grumpy, so the temperature of the water was unpredictable. So it's safer for my mom to wash my hair, she could check the temperature. But Had I not known that my late grandpa, 外公, washed my mom's hair for her until his last years, I would have never known that hair washing was my mom's love language. So I got to appreciate it even better. And then also I found that stories could give an eternal life to my late family members. Yeah, as I mentioned, my 外公 lives forever as the handsome young man in the legends in the old Shanghai. And then later, when my 爷爷 died, it came natural to me to summon the power of stories to revive him as well. And then after I started to publish fiction in my 20s, I've always preserved the nonfiction writing as a way to expand the scope of my life and also explore more of the world. I spent several years interviewing people who had been through the period when the state-owned factories were shut down to make way for China's acceptance into the WTO and also China's future economic takeoff. Both my parents had been industrial workers and lost their jobs in that period. I was talking about the late 90s and the early 21st century. And for me, that was a tough time in my life, in the life of my family, because it was marked with, several attempted break-ins and then numerous visits of the rats to my home. And then also my parents' endless quarrels, often about money. But for others, I found during my interviews, that time could be an opportunity for a new life. A previous colleague of my mom made 3 trips to Russia to sell goods. And he didn't make a great fortune out of his foreign adventures as he hoped, but he acquired just enough money to invest in Shanghai's soon would be lucrative real estate. And then I don't know whether Fuchsia knows about this, but when I went to London for graduate school in 2011, the majority of the residents in Chinatown there spoke with a Northeast Chinese accent. I was curious, so I found someone who was willing to talk to me. And then she left her hometown in the Northeast China, Dongbei, after the factory she'd been working for got closed in the same period. And then she told me there were many cases like her. And then I immediately know as a Chinese person that Dongbei used to be the center of heavy industry in China. And then so they got hit quite hard, and many people had to transform their lives. And then so as you can see, I had been gravitated towards topics like displacement and immigration by the time I moved to the US. Now it's my 6th year, really just living in this foreign country. But I really think, and I'm very grateful to be in this position. And I think it is an optimal position for a writer to always be an outsider. And in my case, I'm an outsider to both China and the US. Without overseas living experience, I wouldn't have had, different reference points to understand what's so unique about my hometown. And then in the US, something that looks completely mundane to the locals may strike me as unusual, as something worth exploring. And then, so yeah, I continued doing interviews in Los Angeles, in St. Louis, in Iowa City. And then, yeah, of course, for every story, it takes a lot of work, from materials to a meaningful narrative. I think we will discuss about that, and we will discuss that later. And yeah, I just want to close this sort of speech on this note. I always find myself in awe of the world and of humanity, because there's just so many surprises every day. And then just by wandering around the streets and talking to people, I feel the world is just full of wonder, right? And then I also can't help but share my joy of discoveries with my readers. And so I write. And in that regard, I'm not that different from my 10-year-old self. I wanted to invite, I mean, that problematic final sentence was actually true. So I wanted to invite others to appreciate the snoring sounds in my family because I just found them lovely and amusing. And thank you.
Thank you for the beautiful talk, Jianan, and thanks for sharing your treasured family moments. And hopefully that will also lend a view, a worldview to the writers who want to submit their stories, that they can not just look into their families, but also go on the street, roam around and talk to whoever they want to, and look at the world just like a 10-year-old. Thank you. So let me ask you both something. Which 3 words do you associate with the theme generations, and why? Fuchsia, do you want to start?
I was just, so well, the first one is cooking. And I think that I've already said a bit about that, the big changes, dramatic changes in China. And the second one is inheritance. Because I just feel that that cooking, that inheriting recipes, learning from elder people in your family is one way of carrying forward your family culture and creating your own. And I feel that, you know, obviously in my case, my inheritance is a strange inheritance because it's a mixture of things that I learned from my mother and things that I've learned from a country at the other side of the world, to which I've become very close. But it's very important to me, and I feel that I've created my own sort of way of cooking, which in so many ways reminds me of people, some of whom I've lost, some of whom in the last 2 years I'm separated from. And back to China specifically, that I hope so much that young people in China will pay attention to the potential inheritance from the elders who know so much, not only about cooking, but also about pickling and preserving and about health and medicine. And this is part for me of the wealth of Chinese culture. I was very curious, actually, Jianan, that you'd said that you'd been learning, you know, asking your mother for recipes later in life. And I wondered whether you were finding yourself drawn to a very traditional way of cooking, maybe the flavors of your childhood, or whether, I'm guessing like me, that your cultural influences now are extremely eclectic. Yeah. And then the third word was restaurants. Again, I've spoken a bit about that, but one thing that I'm always speaking about when I'm, you know, giving talks in the West is that a lot of people in the West think that the restaurant was invented in sort of 18th century Paris, but actually you have them in Song Dynasty, Hangzhou and Kaifeng, and so it's a very Chinese form of culture. And yes, just in terms of generations, the sort of dramatic changes in the types of restaurant and so on, but also I guess inheritance as well, with the Lao Zihao and the old names and the restaurants that somehow, for example, like Chen Ma Po Doufu, this restaurant that has its roots in late Qing Dynasty Chengdu, when Mrs. Chen, the woman after whom the dish is named, ran a restaurant in Fuchsia in Chengdu, and that restaurant has somehow, you know, come through the ages, you know, been nationalized, been privatized again, and has expressed all the different generations of the last century of Chinese history under the same name.
Jianan, what about you?
My 3 keywords are home, bonding, and dream. So home, I was just, by talking about home, I would just also answer Fujia's question. So I don't think home is a concept you can take for granted, because I mean, I grew up in Shanghai, so I used to take it for granted, right? But after I left my home and started to live in some other part of the world, and then I just miss my home so much. And also for me, one image I got regarding home is home cooking. I mean, because I'm Shanghainese, so home cooking is a big part of our life. And then I asked my mom about that. And I know, for her, like building a home for me means to cook for me, to make sure that I live healthy, because my mom paid much attention to a balanced meal. I have to get enough, veggies, proteins, and everything. I think your mom usually put a lot of thought to it. And also she makes sure that everything looks nice. And there's also some very unique, I think, Chinese elements in that, because my mom also, especially on special occasions, my mom makes sure that the dishes also convey like positive messages. Like if we say in Shanghai, a very famous dish, and I miss a lot, is 四喜高夫. It's like 4 blessings, like bean custard or something. And then 4 blessing, it's like really, really good, something really, really good. So my mom always makes sure that she has it when on some holidays. And also before each of my big exams, my mom would make sure there's no, like we call yellowfish on the desk, because there's a saying in Chinese that yellowfish, 黄鱼脑袋, it's like a yellowfish's head is like they don't have a good brain, so you cannot have that. So yeah, it's fun to think about. And also I'm just right now, because I live away from home, so I'm also I'm putting a lot of thoughts how to just maintain like the feeling of home, and how to also I have to build a home here. It's kind of hard, and I think this is a difficult question for everyone. And then bonding, it's a sort of concept related to home, but in a different way. But when I think about the generations, I would think about the different generations bond in a very different way. And because, like, for example, like my grandpa and we played a lot of board games while I was small, because my grandpa was good at a lot of things. My grandpa could do calligraphy, could do traditional Chinese painting, and he was extremely good at playing chess. I could never win him. If I could win him like one round in a single day, that would really just make me feel so proud. And then, yeah, I miss him because of that. And then my parents and I bonded in a very different way, because my parents didn't have that much time for playing games with me, right? And then so my parents and I think our bonding happened more like on the way to school. They sent me to school. Back then I was sitting, my dad carried me on the back seat of his bicycle to school, so we would chat. And my mom and I would go, we call it just window side shopping every weekend. And yeah, it's a way of our bonding. And the last one is a dream. Oh, I also think like dream is a very important, like a keyword, I think, in the Chinese language in a few decades recently, really, because we can really see like how different generations' dream changed. For my grandfather's generation, because they've been through the war, and they just wanted everyone to be safe and sound. That's their biggest dream, and it was already very hard for them to achieve back then. And for my parents' generation, they wanted to go to college, but neither of my parents went to college. So that remained their dream. And then they forced their dream, they wanted me to realize that dream. And I think that speaks for a lot of people in my generation. Yeah.
Thank you. We've actually also collected what everyone thinks of their keywords are for generations, and there are 500 of them. The most common ones are gap, memory, transition, and family. And the most surprising ones are pickles, 单位, which can be directly translated as work unit, endured wisdom, binge, hope, crush, diet, smell, and modern love. do are any of these sticking out to you guys?
I thought pickles was a really interesting one, obviously.
Yes, you mentioned that earlier. Yes.
Both what Jianan was saying about the flavors of home and nostalgia for traditional ways of doing things. And I think that in China, I mean, everyone associates, I mean, all over the world, people associate food with hometown. But in China, you have a particularly strong sense of food as hometown. And there's that legend of Jiang Qian, the ancient official in China, who abandoned his post in the north of China to go back to Jiannan because he missed the perch and water shield soup of his hometown. But
wow. That's another amazing story there. Speaking of pickles, I just thought of my grandma's pickled gingers, and coincidentally, my family name is Jiang, so we take a lot of pride in eating gingers. And I believe that every family in China has maybe like different family style pickles. So maybe that's another thing to think about writing. And Fuchsia, you have researched and written about China as a non-Chinese person, whereas Jianan, you grew up in China and is now writing Chinese stories in English. Can you both talk more about your cross-cultural writing experience? For example, what is the most difficult thing for you, and what do you think of the feedback from your Chinese and non-Chinese readers?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
Yes, you can start.
Yeah, well, I suppose that, I mean, for me, it's been a very strange series of events, because originally my purpose was to write about China for a Western audience that didn't really understand necessarily much about China. So that was very clearly what I was doing. I was an outsider writing about China for Westerners, for outsiders. But now that my books are published in Chinese, I'm in this very strange situation that actually I seem to be writing for Chinese people as well, which I never expected. But I suppose, you know, as Jianan was saying about points of view, about being an outsider, is that in a way, as a writer, what you're trying to do is find a fresh perspective on the familiar and find, you know, interesting and different and new ways of writing about life, about noticing the world. And so I think in one sense you have a huge advantage as an outsider, because everything is new and surprising. And as Jianan said as well, the things that you notice are different when you have that outsider viewpoint. And a lot of Chinese readers have said that they, you know, my writing about Chinese food and culture makes them notice things that they hadn't thought of before, because it's just the background to everyday life. And it's the same, I should say, with just Chinese friends and what they notice about, you know, the West and about Britain. And then I suppose that in one sense, you know, I've spent for, you know, more than 20 years, I've been putting myself in situations where I'm usually the only foreigner. I'm speaking in a language that is not my own and that is still very difficult even after 25 years. And also often I'm the only woman, because I spend a lot of time with chefs, of course, who are mostly men. And so I would say, I mean, it's always interesting, sometimes challenging, you know, and there've been difficult periods when I've just been homesick and so on. But I find it constantly fascinating. And I suppose also what I'm trying to do is, you know, I think China has this really fascinating culinary culture, and it has a very strange status in the rest of the world, which is that, you know, Chinese food is universally popular and recognized, but it's often underappreciated. So everyone loves eating Chinese food, but they don't often realize that it's a very sophisticated and thoughtful and deep culinary culture, and that people in China have been, you know, writing about food, thinking about food, developing techniques, philosophizing about food for centuries. And so what I'm trying to do is write about that in a detailed way for Western audiences. And one of the challenges is that, you know, in China, you have a whole lot of words related to food and cooking, which are untranslatable. We don't have equivalents for words for cooking methods. One of the things that I have actually had most fun writing about is texture, kogam, mouthfeel. And you know, the chapter in Shots and Sichuan Pepper called The Rubber Factor, because the strange thing about that is that, you know, in China, people love food experiences, textural experiences, which Westerners on the whole find really disgusting. So the words in English are things like slimy, gristly, you know, slippery, which sound really unattractive in English when associated with food. So the challenge for me has been trying to write from a place of love and affection, and to write playfully and amusingly, you know, making a joke of the disgustingness in Westerners' minds, but at the same time saying, look, you know, can you have a new perspective? Try to appreciate. So, I mean, I had a lot of fun with that, I think, as a cross-cultural issue, which is quite difficult to resolve. But, you know, as a writer, I'm trying to bridge that gap.
It's like, yeah, I think it's a very important job you're doing, because you know what both sides are thinking. You're trying to bridge the gap somehow. And Jianan, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, first I want to just say thank you to Fuchsia, because I'm one of the readers who, you know, used to take a lot of things in my culture for granted. And then I think one time you mentioned something about soup. Like, because I used to be not interested in the watery soup, like on the Chinese dinner table. And then you explained that's because we have a whole, you know, a whole process of eating. And then after we eat something very with rich flavors, and we have to clear our palate with the soup. And then after that, we will feel comfortable, right? And then that was an eye-opening for me. And then really reading your books and just reading your interviews, sometimes I just have a lot of those mind-blowing moments. And then for me, so it was mine was a very strange literary trajectory, because 6 years ago I got tired of writing in Chinese. It's more because my life back then was I lived a quite narrow life, which means I had a stable job back then. I was teaching in an international high school. And then I also started to publish stories quite a bit. And then I just thought I started to repeat myself. Like, I kept writing about the same subject matter, and then nothing really interested me. And I took a lot of efforts to explore different neighborhoods in Shanghai, but that didn't really help me to make a breakthrough as I would expect it, if that makes sense. So I decided to do a life experiment on myself. That's why I moved to the United States and switched my language to English, writing language to English. And I just wanted to see how far the writing in a new language would take me. That was a life experiment. So I didn't think, I didn't even fully process what would come out of it. But it's been tough to write in a different language, and it's still difficult, very challenging. But I also think the payoff is huge. And then for some of the difficulties, I would say something that got me interested in the topic might not be interesting at all to my for me, it's more like American readers. For example, I wrote a draft about my 外公, the 外公I just mentioned, who's like Wong Kar-wai's movie figure kind of thing. And then the whole thing, I'm excited about old Shanghai, a Chinese person sporting like a three-piece suit and a walking stick. Nobody was interested. Nobody really found that impressive, at least in my class. I'm still doing the PhD. And then I was disappointed. And also this kind of, there's something like this happened a lot of time, because when I started to write my fiction in English, it was about China. Also, I was doing that in Iowa City, like the Iowa Writers Workshop. And also sometimes my classmates would say, why should we care? And there's so much, it's heavily loaded with history. I don't want to be forced to learn so many things about history. But for me, the difficulty is if I don't explain the cultural context, you will never get the punchline, right? And then so I'm still learning how to do it, do it in an interesting way and focus more on the story part and focus more on characters. There are ways to do that, but there's another thing I also want to share here. So it's from my also an amazing friend in Iowa City, and she once said to me, she instead of saying why do I care, as a lot of my American classmates would put in their comment, she said, this amazing friend said, write to the extent that you will make me care, like make me care because I want to care. And then after that, I always put her feedback as sort of like a mantra in my head. I want to write to make people care. And then I will just keep that in mind when I revise my stories and also essays. So yeah, I think that's the most challenging thing about my bilingual writing.
So I hope the audience members will hear you loud and clear. So make us care. I mean, not me, the judges, make the judges care. Next question is about COVID. We chatted briefly before the session about when your next trip is to China. So apparently COVID has kept a lot of people out of China for 2 years now. I don't know when the last time for you, what was for you to be in China, and COVID has put up travel restrictions and prevent you from returning to China. How do you continue to write stories about China from the outside? Jianan, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. It's been 2.5 years since my last visit back to China. And I remember last visit, actually, I did a big tour. I did a book tour. I went to Chengdu first time in my life, and I was just amazed by the food there, honestly. And yeah, as Fuchsia mentioned, not everything is spicy because I don't have a high spicy tolerance level. And then I still get to experience so many different dishes. So, and then after that, I got stuck here in the United States. I moved inside the United States, but I couldn't really just come back. And then, yeah, it's very difficult. I miss home, and I miss a lot of Shanghainese dish. And then I also I don't know. I mean, I'm still suffering from a lack of motivation to write, partly because I'm very far away from something, especially the subject matter of my novel in progress. It's set in Shanghai, so I just really want to go back to Shanghai to make things right and do some interviews, but I couldn't. So to make up for it, I don't know whether it's a good thing to make up for it. Of course, I talk to people in China, right? And then I visited Chinatown quite a bit, like quite often in London. Oh, not London, sorry, in Los Angeles. And then it's very different. It's not the Chinatown in other cities because that Chinatown is very, very old. But then I got very interested in it. There's something there, like a community sense or something there that keeps me revisiting. So I don't know where that would take me, but that's the way I can just manage to control my homesickness. Yeah.
Fuchsia, what about you?
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't been to China for almost exactly 2 years. And that's the longest period away since I was in my early 20s. And so, I've missed it a lot, but I was very lucky because I did spend a lot of time in China for the couple of years before that. And so I have a lot of material that I'm working with now, sort of writing the next book. And I feel that the absence and the distance in a way has sharpened up my feelings for China and for friends in China, because it's been, you know, I've really missed it, and I've missed people, and I've just wanted to, you know, so many places I wanted to go, or bits of research I was in the middle of that I haven't been able to do. But in a funny way, that's made me feel closer in some senses. And so particularly actually through cooking, that I noticed that I was, you know, cooking very traditionally in a Chinese way, and cooking for the festivals, like making chunbing, like the Sichuan spring rolls for in the springtime, making a special meal for Duanwujie, Dragon Boat Festival, making the offerings to the kitchen god in the last month. And then even though I had during lockdown, you know, I would normally have had a Chinese New Year dinner party for New Year's Eve, but I couldn't do that. So I decided to cook everything anyway. So I cooked a big banquet of 12 dishes, and then I took a photograph, and then I put it in boxes, and I gave it to friends and neighbors. But I suppose that what I'm hoping is that the sort of feeling that the missing China is actually going to give something to the writing, because like be a sort of seasoning of longing and sharpness to it. So that's what I'm hoping. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to say to the prospective writers who are in China at the moment? Are you a bit of jealous of them?
Oh, well, I mean, of course, you know, I would love to be there myself, but I suppose that, you know, it is a very interesting period to be in this, you know, this sort of separation. And I think it's probably very interesting from the point of view of people in China as well, you know, how this separation and the closing of borders has affected their feelings about China and the rest of the world and their relationships. So I would say, you know, I would hope that lots of very interesting work will come out of this. I mean, maybe people don't want to write so much about the pandemic period now because it's kind of painful and too present, but in the long term, it's been a quite sort of shaking experience for all of us, and something interesting for writers.
Mm-hmm. Now it's time for the Q&A session. First questions for Jianan. As a fiction writer, what new things have you learned from writing nonfiction, and what skills can you borrow from fiction writing? This is from one of the audience members.
So from nonfiction, mostly I think, well, the fiction writing and nonfiction writing are similar in a way that they both require you to make scenes vivid, to pay much attention to details, and then also to make meanings in way of forming a narrative, if that makes sense. And then I think I would lend my fiction skills to nonfiction writings in a way that I still want to tell a good story. I want the story to be moving, and also I want the story, not that the story itself, not the plot itself, to be complete, but to give people a sense of closure. And then what I've learned from nonfiction writing is more from the process, because nonfiction writing really requires me to work a lot, like outside my room, because I really have to, if I want to write something if I want to write something about a place, I have to revisit this place like very often. And sometimes I have to ask different people to show me around the same spot and get their perspective. And then from that I learned, from that I really just learned a lot, not only just as a writer, because I can just see have more than one, you know, facets. And then also I think I learned a lot as a human being, because I just get to appreciate the diversity of a city, and also just of life in general.
I hope that answers your question. Next one's for Fuchsia. being frugal is still older generation's basic values, even though we are richer now. I wonder if Fuchsia knows about some sequence of cooking trying to save oil. I think it means secrets of cooking, trying to save oil, sauce, as advised by older people. And even older people in one family hate wasting food. There are still conflicts between generations on clearing plates. Did Fuchsia notice this gap of values between generations and differences in China and in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. And so in the UK, for example, my grandparents grew up in wartime. And so when they were young, they had rationing, and they were very used to being extremely frugal and economical with food. And so my parents' generation grew up with that atmosphere of frugality. And so I would say there's often a tension between my brother and sister and me and our parents, in the sense that, I mean, I feel sometimes guilty for being more extravagant than my parents, or for eating out more, or being more wasteful, because I'm very aware of their values of being more restrained. And in China, certainly, I mean, I think, you know, to one extent, it's just something between young people and older people, and not just about, I mean, not particularly about the historical context, but in any circumstance, there's a tension between older people and younger people about about consumption. But I suppose, yes, in China, it's particularly the case. But I suppose what's interesting is that, you know, I was saying that in China now, you have a more wasteful and extravagant and gluttonous younger generation who are now facing all the problems of excess, both personal health problems and global health problems, i.e. ecological problems. And so, so now you've got in China also some younger people becoming vegetarian. And some of them even in a strict way, like Westerners, not the traditional flexible Chinese way of eating, you know, vegetarian diet. And also people, you know, young women in China dieting and trying to eat less. So I think it's quite complicated. But I suppose that, you know, I go back to what I said about, you know, the value of frugality in traditional Chinese cooking is one that is both very old-fashioned and very modern, because it really speaks to the issues we face now about not eating too much salt, too many additives, too much meat, eating more vegetables. And so it's both old-fashioned and very contemporary. And so I think we need to recognize more that these old-fashioned values are actually exactly what we need to solve some of our modern problems.
I have the next question for you from Si, which is kind of linked to your answer just now. So it goes, I have a question for Fuchsia about cooking. I wonder if Fuchsia has noticed a change of attitude to the use of animal fat in Chinese family. Since I am at home these days, and I noticed that even mom is aware that she could not eat too much of that, which is animal fat, due to the high level of cholesterol, she still loves it because it will be more delicious to cook eggplant and cabbage mustard, etc. I wonder if this is because of the memory and experience of hunger.
Well, this is a really curious one, because, you know, in the West, like my grandparents' generation would have had no question about using butter and lard and beef dripping as delicious, you know, animal fats. And then we had this big movement in saying that they're very unhealthy and they're bad for you because of the cholesterol content. And so what happened in the West is that we had this big promotion of margarine, like artificial butter, essentially. And so when I was a child and a teenager, people felt that eating these artificial these artificial fats that were vegetable oils made to seem like the mouthfeel of animal fats was very healthy. They then discovered that these fats called trans fats were actually terrible for your health. And so now, funnily enough, in the West, there is now a movement back towards saying that actually animal fats are very healthy. That's not that you should eat them in excess. And in China, I guess it's similar. So in the past, people couldn't eat too much, lard, for example, because they didn't have so much. And I think that, I mean, one of the things that has always made me very sad is that I really respect the traditional Chinese understanding of healthy eating, and I find it very effective. So it's not scientific in a way that you can prove everything, but as a whole system, it seems very effective and functional at maintaining health and preventing disease. And also, funnily enough, the traditional, in the West, people talk all the time about the Mediterranean diet as being the model of healthy eating. And what they really mean by the Mediterranean diet is eating lots of grains and vegetables, bit of seafood, not too much meat, and actually olive oil, but mainly eating this sort of vegetable diet. And actually a lot of it applies very much to the traditional Chinese diet. And one thing that I find frustrating in China is that so many both ordinary people and professional chefs have this idea that Western nutrition is somehow advanced because it's scientific and because we have statistics and so on. But it seems to me that a lot of Western nutritional advice is quite, has been misleading, like about margarine, artificial fats, and is also not very useful in an everyday sense. Like, we don't really read all the labels of everything, and we don't measure the grams of the amount of protein we have, so the Chinese system is very functional. And so, for example, if you're telling me that Chinese people, if this audience member is telling me that Chinese people are rejecting the traditional way of using a little animal fat to cook very healthy vegetables, I'd say that's a tragedy. It's a very healthy way to eat. You're not just eating a little animal fat, using it to flavor lots of vegetables seems to be exactly what we need to be doing. And just this idea that animal fats are unhealthy is, I think also it's very contentious and controversial whether, to what extent there is a direct link between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. It's not totally clear. So I would urge this person's mother to go on cooking her vegetables with a bit of lard.
See, I hope you are hearing us. We still have 2 more questions for both of you. First one, could you please recommend one of your favorite nonfiction books and tell us why? Jianan, what's your favorite book?
I would recommend one of Fuchsia's book is, of course, you have to check out if you haven't. And then I will also recommend the book of another judge, Peter Hessler. I read all of his works and I enjoy them all. And I think you could just, I think you can just choose whatever title that entices to you the most at this moment. And then I remember one essay in his latest book about Egypt. And in order to learn about Cairo, he goes on an adventure with a local trash collector, so that the whole piece is written from the perspective of a trash collector. And then just see how magic that is to observe the city from that perspective.
And Fuchsia?
Yeah, well, one that springs to mind that I read not long ago. It's called The Land Where Lemons Grow by Helena Attlee. So this is a book about citrus fruit, which didn't sound to me like the most exciting subject, but it's one of these books that reveals in extraordinary complexity and fascination a subject that you didn't know anything about. And it's written by the author. She's an expert in gardens, and it's really about citrus fruits, and they're growing in Italy. But she tells all these different stories from different regions of Italy. There are people in it. There's a whole, there are all these, anyway, it's sort of botanical and historical and social, and it's just the most amazing work of art, I think.
That sounds lovely and delicious to read.
Actually, Peter Hessler's River Town, that for me that's the best book by a foreigner about China, and yeah, just extraordinary piece of work.
That's also something I'm rereading right now to inspire me to join the competition also. Another question for both of you. What type of stories do you expect to read in this writing contest? Fuchsia?
I don't know. I mean, I would hope to read the unexpected. I mean, you know, surprising perspectives and things that would be unpredictable, that will give me a new view of something. So yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't have any expectations, but I'm sure there'll be lots of original ideas and pieces of work.
And Jianan?
I try not to set an expectation because I want to be surprised. And also, I think every writer has a story and they want to tell. And then no matter, you know, whether that story is more about the personal, like life, or something about a public, social or political question, I don't think I have preference for either. And I think for every writer, the most important thing is to tell your story, to tell the story that matters most to you.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a wrap for the Q&A session for the guest speakers. In case, do you have anything else to say to the audience members before you go? The next part will be me answering questions about the contest. Jianan, Fuchsia, do you have anything to add?
No, just I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to contribute. It should be very exciting.
Great.
Yeah, and also just thank you all for being here with us. And yeah, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your writings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. So the next part will be me answering some of the most interesting and frequently asked questions for the writing contest. Question 1, what are the common values that you're looking for the work submitted? So the entries will be judged based on their content, style, and public value. In other words, whether they tell good story or explore a certain phenomenon, what the public can learn from the article, and the quality of writing, just as 6 Tone seeks to find fresh voices from today's China. And you can see from our page on the old pieces we write, we are looking for the stories of human interest that go beyond well-worn narratives and provide unique perspectives, in-depth observations, and engaging storytelling. Question number 2, I intend to create a substantively new work related to the theme of generations, but this work may draw from the piece that I've previously published elsewhere, as well as some aren't published yet. Is that acceptable? The answer is you may use some material from your previous works, but the content of your submission should be substantively new. Please cite your previous works in the footnotes wherever you draw from them. Question number 3, when will I hear back about whether my submission is nominated or rejected? So we are looking for entries by April 30th, 2022. Authors will receive an automatic reply by email to confirm the submission. After the deadline, 6 Tone will contact the authors of articles as selected for publication and or finalists once decisions are made. Those that haven't been contacted by the time the finalists are announced are free to submit their pieces elsewhere. Again, we expect to announce finalists by the end of May 2022, and the winners will be announced late in summer. Question number 4, is it okay to provide a personal recount given that I'm not currently based in China to do field work? And the answer is sure. The personal recount should be based on your real experience, and you should be able to provide some contact details, and or evidence if needed. All nominated pieces will go through a fact-checking process. Another question, what if I'm worried that my story may offend someone I know in real life? The answer is, we urge you to follow common ethics when writing your story and disclose information at your own discretion. You may use the license for characters in a story if you or the person in question feel uncomfortable using real names, but please make explicit note of the aliases in the article, and you would need to disclose the real names to Sixth Tone's editors during the fact-checking process. A new question, is first-hand interview an absolutely necessary for nonfiction writing? The answer is, it depends on what you're writing about. We strongly encourage first-hand interviews because they are a good way for you to learn about people's experiences and opinions. But if you are writing a historical story, for example, you may not be able to speak with the people you're writing about and will instead look through primary sources like old documents and photos. Careful personal observations may also let you pay attention to nonverbal information. Question, I write in Chinese. If I wish to enter the contest with an English-speaking partner, where should I find like-minded people? We unfortunately cannot help you connect with English-speaking partner, and you're welcome to find someone on your own. You may reach out to English-speaking acquaintances or writing communities. And another question, can we get a video recording of this webinar afterwards? The recording of the webinar will be available on Sixth Tone's YouTube channel, and we'll also publish a summary article of the webinar on Sixth Tone's website too. So stay tuned to our websites and social media, including Facebook, Instagram, what else? Twitter and YouTube. And finally, thanks for tuning in this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are, and stay tuned to the competition. And we're very much looking forward to seeing your entries. Thank you and goodbye.
The characteristic of a generation are always defined by the relation between one generation to another.
Intergenerational communication across these gaps is a big theme in Chinese society. Any story that sees China as a monolith, you kind of have to open that box and just look at the internal debates.
我们要讲的恰恰不是要努力拔着我们的头发要往上升，我恰恰觉得那就是一个叫故事里的中国或者中国人。